Indigenous people in this country are markedly overrepresented in Canadian prisons and in the justice system of the country. So much so that when he first took office, the Prime Minister directed his Minister of Justice in her mandate letter to, quote, reduce the rate of incarceration amongst Indigenous Canadians. That was November 2015.
Every year, Canada, a country that prides itself on justice and equality, fails its Indigenous peoples. How is it acceptable that Indigenous individuals representing just 5% of the population account for over 30% of incarcerated people? This isn't an accident. It's a result of centuries of systemic racism, neglect, and injustice. Canada's invasive government policies were designed to dismantle Indigenous cultures. Residential schools ripped children from their families, forcing them to abandon their languages, identities, and homes in order to assimilate with society. Entire generations were traumatized, and trauma doesn't disappear. It echoes and ripples throughout history, past and present. Today, Indigenous people in Canada still feel the sting of these haunting echoes. This legacy lives on in poverty, addiction, mental illness, and broken social systems. When communities are stripped of resources and opportunities, how can we expect anything but desperation?
Both my parents were survivors of the residential school, and as a result of their experience there, how it impacted their lives, so it impacted myself and my brothers and my sisters. We traveled into various foster homes, and in those foster homes endured through all kinds of different abuses, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. So I was deprived of love and nurturing and safety. And because I was deprived of those things, how it manifested into a lack of self-worth, no identity whatsoever, and ultimately being completely fearful all the time of the adults in my life. So I found myself wrapped and caught in a crack cocaine addiction, alcoholism. I found myself, in and out of abusive relationships, and ultimately serving various bits of time, and then ultimately finding myself in a federal penitentiary for the trafficking of cocaine.
It's shameful, and the numbers speak for themselves. Indigenous peoples are incarcerated at 6 times the rate of non-Indigenous Canadians. For Indigenous women, the situation is even worse. They now make up nearly half of Canada's female inmate population. Half. This isn't justice. This is a pipeline from generational trauma to poverty to crime, from neglect to incarceration. This is a system built to punish the original owners of this land instead of heal and acknowledge.
Once you get that label of being high risk, it sticks with you. And that leads to more time in custody, fewer opportunities for conditional release, worst chances for successful reintegration, which means higher recidivism, and the whole cycle starts again.
Reservation.
Damnation.
Let's call it what it is: systemic abandonment. Chronic underfunding means Indigenous communities lack access to housing, education, clean water, and health care.
Echoes the sentiments of the Indigenous community that Canada has not done right by them. Human Rights Watch questions how one of the world's most water-rich nations is unable to provide safe and clean drinking water to its communities. Ottawa pledged to end all water advisories on reserves by 2021, but that hasn't happened. And we know as of September, 28 First Nations communities were still subject to long-term water advisories, which alert people that their drinking water isn't clean nor safe. The report.
When poverty is the only reality, crime becomes necessary for survival. When children see no opportunity for their future, the cycle continues, generation after generation. How can we as a country blame crime on Indigenous people when our own government's actions are the catalyst? Canada turns a blind eye to Indigenous people's struggle, yet blames and punishes them when they are driven to crime. Canada's justice system is full of prejudice. Indigenous peoples are more likely to be arrested, denied bail, and handed longer sentences than non-Indigenous people. It's no secret that police interactions with minorities are on average more hostile and violent, and unfortunately, Indigenous peoples are not an exception.
We found, again, terrible outcomes with respect to Indigenous people who are incarcerated in federal corrections. And these included, for example, being overrepresented in use of force, overrepresented in maximum security institution, overrepresented in structured intervention units, which is the former administrative segregation regime. They are more likely to also be labeled as gang members. They're more likely to self-injure. They're more likely to attempt suicide. They're also overrepresented in the last...
Cold Lake RCMP responded to a 911 call of an attempted stabbing at a transit stop on 50th Street and 43rd Avenue in Cold Lake. 2 officers found a male armed with an edged weapon. RCMP say the officers used what they are calling intervention options, including using a firearm against the man. The man was then taken to hospital and died from his injuries. The Alberta Serious Incident Response Team is now investigating. Farron Atkinson, the brother of the man who died, says he is Matthew Atkinson, also known in the community as Fabian Scanny. Farron said he and his brother are 60 Scoop survivors, and his brother had his own challenges from that life-altering incident. We'll have more on this story in our evening newscast.
Even in the courtroom, systemic discrimination is persistent. The justice system sees numbers and statistics, not people. It sees punishment without regard for nuance. The Canadian government has acknowledged and addressed certain systemic biases, but the end result is usually the same: virtue signalling and empty gestures. Such is apparent in the case of the murder of Colton Boushie, a 22-year-old Indigenous man that was fatally shot by white farmer Gerald Stanley after Boushie and some friends trespassed on his property. Stanley was originally charged with second-degree murder and manslaughter, but due to Canada's prevalent discrimination in the justice system, Stanley found himself acquitted on both charges. During the trial, the jury selection system allowed the lawyers to use peremptory challenges to reject a number of potential jurors without giving a specific reason. 5 potential jurors out of the 750 picked for screening appeared to be First Nations and therefore were challenged by the defence, leaving what appeared to be an all-white jury. Gerald Stanley got away scot-free and Colton Boushie was never given the justice he deserved. In the words of Tasha Hubbard, a director at CBC, the RCMP's initial press release, rather than focusing on the use of a gun to kill a human being, instead said that some of the young people with Boushie were suspected of theft and had trespassed on Stanley's farm, and that someone died as a result of a verbal exchange on private property. News media published that message, and very quickly, vitriolic racism flooded social media, with people saying that Stanley was a hero, that he should have killed all the Indigenous youth and left no witnesses, and that Boushie was now simply brown bread. Less outwardly hateful, but no less damaging, were the posts maintaining that Stanley was within his rights to protect his property, despite Canadian law saying differently. What was made clear was the notion that property rights are more important than the lives of Indigenous people. The aftermath of this case and the response of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau further established the complete unwillingness to make any meaningful contribution to the issue, opting for the same virtue, signalling and empty gestures previously mentioned, as you will see in the following video.
Us to say that this Canada will not be a nation where the senseless killing of Indigenous youth is considered okay. That Canada will not be a nation defined by racial suspicion, a failed judicial process, or 150 years of broken promises. But platitudes are not enough. To the Prime Minister, what steps will he take to reassure the Bushi family and Indigenous youth across this country that justice will be made real for Colton Bushi?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our thoughts, of course, are with the family and friends of Colton Bushi. While it would be completely inappropriate to comment on the specifics of this case, we understand that there are systemic issues in our criminal justice system that we must address. We are committed to broad-based reform to address these issues. As a country, we must and we can do better. Our government is committed to working hard every day to ensure justice for all Canadians.
Speaking about specifics, when the justice system fails an individual, there's appeals, there's legal precedent. But when justice fails a people, it is incumbent upon leaders to take a stand. Because let's be clear, this system didn't just fail Colton Bushi. This system has failed Indigenous people all the way back to Poundmaker, and it has to stop. So in this watershed moment, to the Prime Minister, what concrete steps will he take to deal with the huge legal inequities that are faced by Indigenous people all across this country?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
While the government continues to do the same fake sympathy virtue signalling song and dance, that is not to say they are doing absolutely nothing. This issue has gotten far too large to sit back and idle, so there is hope. Indigenous-led justice programs and cultural healing initiatives like Indigenous Youth Roots prove restorative justice works. Programs grounded in traditional practices and culture, centered on healing, accountability, and community, are the main glimmer of this hope. The government is also trying to better the situation, keyword trying. The Canadian government has begun to implement certain calls to action, legislation, and plans to help curb the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the justice system, such as the Federal Framework to Reduce Recidivism, the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, the Indigenous Community Corrections Initiative, which supports alternatives to custody and reintegration projects that take into account the unique circumstances of Indigenous people in Canada, providing culturally relevant services like counselling, treatment, life skills, coaching, family reunification, and addressing the effects of residential schools and involvement with child welfare systems, as well as an abundance of different educational programs. The most important thing the government has done is the application of the Gladue Report. The Gladue Report is a pre-sentencing or bail hearing report usually prepared by Gladue caseworkers at the request of the judge, defence counsel, or Crown Attorney. These reports contain recommendations to the court about what an appropriate sentence might be and include information about the Aboriginal person's background, such as history regarding residential schools, child welfare removal, physical or sexual abuse, underlying developmental or health issues, and substance abuse. This report essentially forces the court to consider all alternative options rather than prison when sentencing, and makes the court understand the factors that led to the crime in the first place. The main issue with these government initiatives is that they are not consistently implemented, creating a discrepancy between what the government is telling Canadians they are doing and what is actually being done. The Canadian government must follow up and ensure these initiatives and programs are being implemented positively and effectively. The overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in Canada's justice system is a national disgrace. It is a stain on our country's conscience. It's time for Canada to do better, to confront and apologise for its past, repair the present, and build a better future. Reconciliation for Indigenous peoples isn't charity or unequal treatment. It's a moral and legal obligation to the original inhabitants of the land we live on. How can we expect to be proud to live in a country that has treated such an integral people of Canada this poorly if they do not take the appropriate steps to fix past mistakes and pave a future of equality and justice for everyone?